Hello, welcome to our fifth and last panel, which is entitled Presenting Early Stages of Fieldwork, Sharing Debatable Insights. I'm very happy that the presenters, the historians that are here today, are also my colleagues, and they are Urška Strle, Petra Testen Koren, and Francesca Rolandi. The first one will be Urška Strle with her paper or research entitled Mobility in the Post-War Border Areas, Detecting Refugees in Gender Perspective. Urška Strle completed her PhD about Slovenians in Canada, emigrant through the prism of oral testimony in 2010. And since 2013, she works as a research fellow at the Department of History, where she also teaches. She's interested in migration history, gender history, and oral history. Urška, please.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me? Today I will speak about an issue that is not directly connected to violent deeds as we were used to in the previous speeches, but are consequences of violence that actually took place during the war and also in the post-war eras. I will just give my PowerPoint presentation as a kind of a visual subtitles of what I have collected in the archives, and along with some pictures and maps that you will have a better idea. In many places of Europe witnessed an extremely unstable political development between 1914 and the early 20s, a period labeled also as a crisis of sovereignty. Beside the overall war weariness, the territories of the collapsing dynastic empires faced radical and uncertain socio-political development, which affected also traditional loyalties. Post-war consolidation of the newly established state powers was deeply grounded in nationalism, although all of them demonstrated a multi-ethnic reality. Changed integrity of once existing states and volatility of the frontiers faced unprecedented social dimensions. One of the unwanted consequences was the transformation of certain social groups into national minorities and stateless persons who failed to fit the national borders. Hannah Arendt's observation that higher ratio of potentially stateless persons corresponds with high possibilities for states to gradually transform into a police or totalitarian political entities proves to be extremely suggestive. In addition, Aristide Zolberg convincingly showed that the European refugee crisis presented one of the strongest motivations for the United States to introduce the immigration quota system in the 20s, a regulation affecting particularly the most violent and socially savage parts of Austral Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. Such a short historical outline served me as a starting point to conduct my research on post-war mobility, which definitely implied a great deal of violence, pressure, and uncertainties, but also demonstrated economic aspirations and relations to the pre-war migratory patterns, as well as pre-war social connections. In regard to the migratory perspectives, there are many historical scenarios reflecting various regional specifics, although there are also many generalities. Today, I will focus on the territory that was part of Carniola before the war and administered by the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes after the armistice. These were the two districts of Radovljica and Logatec. They're marked with red color. I hope you see. Yes. These two districts were, apart from touristic Bled and the industrial area around Jesenice, mostly rural and economically not particularly affluent parts of the new state. My preference to choose the two districts instead of national framework helped me conduct spatially limited yet intense inspection on the issue. As border regions are usually subjected to strict state control over mobility of the population, the chosen archival fonts contained interesting documentation regarding people on the move. They revealed policies, directives, and reports of multiple administrative layers, both superior to the districts, like national and regional, and also inferior ones, municipal and local, but also contain personal documents, many with interesting biographical data. Besides the archival material from these two border districts, it's quite rich, transparently organized and distinguished by well-executed, detailed archival inventories. The look into the documents reveals and presents many perspectives on the mobility and the refugees as well, but brings about also many dilemmas. In today's presentation, I tend to bring into focus the phenomenon of the refugeeism in the post-war times. The definition of the term refugee is quite problematic. As many researchers have shown, dealing with the refugees relates to the political consideration formed in pursuit of certain political goals, what makes the definition open to alternations. Refugeeism is usually understood as a migration, mobility with certain amount of coercion, although the decision to seek refuge has always been arbitrary, but to a certain degree, stretching from exposure to direct persecution to premonition, which is merely a feeling, sensing of possible danger. Although behind the motivation to flee across the border there was not always a direct violent threat, post-war refugees in vast numbers responded to the violence aroused by the war and post-war times. The expression refugee was greatly publicized among Slovenes from 1914 on, with the masses of refugees stirred by the war, refugees who did not stop appearing when the war was officially over. Massiveness and direct experiences with the refugees. I'm sorry. Okay. Just let me find myself. Massiveness and direct experiences with the refugees resulted in frequent use of the term, which caused its inflation. A refugee addressed a forced migrant, but in some cases it is also used as a colloquial, descriptive term addressing migrants in general. Therefore, we have to differ carefully between language registers of legal or administrative institutions, mass media, and words of the local population, which all appear in the examined documentation. In addition, as the poorest refugees were justified to certain social benefits, some falsely claimed to be refugees. For these reasons, I started to pay attention to all forms of mobility stemming from the documentation and decided to observe the concept of refugees in a wider migratory context. As refugees who entered the research territory after November 1918 demonstrate a great social diversity, there are many parameters through which they could be observed. Ethnic origin, place of departure, occupation/profile, social/financial status, marital status, age, and gender. Naturally, it would be optimal if observation would be intersectional, but availability of data do not always support the holistic approach, although the documentation reveals qualitative insights into certain cases. From examined documentation, it is clear that Kingdom did not want to stimulate the arrival of refugees who were ethnically Slovenes, yet nationally Italians or Austrians. First, the authorities wanted to maintain the nationally aware ethnic element in the disputed territories. Besides, any privileges granted to intelligentsia and economically situated immigrants would and did cause complaint among domestic people. Secondly, in order to prevent the municipalities from financial burdening, in particularly the elderly, disabled persons whose social protection would fall on the burden of the municipalities, were not welcomed. Sometimes they were even rejected. One of the general social-political features which accelerated greatly during the war was the consideration of civil persons or groups as potential dangerous enemies. This attitude did not end with the war, just the contrary, as John Torpy shows in his invention of the passport. State control over the border transition actually intensified after 1918. Mobile population was regarded suspicious also in the new Yugoslav kingdom, which indeed had many external enemies. Secret files of both districts are full of warnings over certain individuals who are suspected of espionage. Dangerous individuals, largely transitional persons, were labeled as communists, anarchists, Indian monarchists, Italian, Hungarian and German spies. Among them was also a handful of women too. In such a paranoid atmosphere, also salesmen, peddlers, refugees, in particular Russian refugees, returnees from captivity, especially those who brought over Russian wives, gypsies, smugglers and vagabonds, were carefully observed in the first post-war years. On the other hand, in the documents of the post-war years, reflected a high-rate mobility that was not only a consequence of post-war social-political changes, but reflected also pre-war migratory patterns. Thus, we can encounter many requests for travel documents to parts of the former monarchy, which were now within the states of Italy, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, but also huge amount of the files recording illegal passing of the border. Those who cross the border legally or illegally usually reveal continuities of social connections and everyday practices within the once united political territory. Reasons for border crossing were justified with existing familial, business, proprietary, medical, administrative, judicial, study relations, which after the establishment of the new frontiers suddenly became international. The question of the post-war refugees in the studied territory calls for a specific periodization, manifesting clear linkages with the wartime. In addition, refugee question remained one of the most complicated and enduring issues in the newly established kingdom that lasted not only the first post-war years, but due to the growing social-political tensions and economic downturn, remained present throughout the 20s and 30s. Intermediary Office for the Refugees from Gorizia region, which already cared for the refugee during the war, reveals continuity of its range of services upon those post-war refugees from the territory which was occupied by Italian army in November 1918. Despite the fact that organizations who cared and controlled the arriving refugees often changed names and competences, it is clear that many patterns how to provide food, clothes, shelter, and work to the refugees were reflecting wartime experiences. Archival sources of the institutions which engaged with the refugee questions are only few, yet precious. The documents from the Office of the Occupied Slovene Territory, for instance, provides a rather panoramic perspective upon question of the Slovene refugees from Italy and Austria. They are describing the state of the refugees, initiatives to solve the refugee questions, and reports on the position of Slovene minority in the neighboring countries. Documents presenting women's parts of the refugee populations are very rare in this font. On the other hand, the availability of the documents, the available documents of the Office for the Protection of the Refugees, which was active from 1918 to 1920, established within the provincial government in Ljubljana, are only few and fragmental, but they present many written requests for refugee support and certificates for existence received. There is a surprisingly great amount of the requests written by women, to whom support is also largely assigned. These documents also provide an introspection how the dispersion of the refugee scattered across various places, definitely not only urban areas, and about the capillary institutional engagement in helping the refugees. Apart from the mentioned offices, also various charity institutions, parish offices, and municipal offices. In the dramatically changed demographic circumstances immediately after the war, it is understandable that refugee support results were so often written by women, as many of their husbands died, were disabled, or missing. Many of these were girls, young women working in the field of domestic service, as seamstresses, as teachers, officials, and so on. Single yet morally impeccable mothers were given priority to receive refugee support, especially those with little children. Morality appears to be one of the most remarkable division lines that splits refugees according to the gender. Some documents reflect double moral standards intended to penalize women over men in case of living in a wild marriage, infection with sexual transmitted disease, having illegitimate child, or being alcoholic. Women who got such labels of depravity were in danger to be expelled from the accepting municipality, and usually their social support was withdrawn. The available documentation shows that refugees, particularly women, presented a substantial share among socially endangered population. However, prevailing social archival silence about their survival strategies actually indicates informal practices enabled by means of social networking, such as work in the private sphere and undeclared work. In December 1918, there were around 16,000 people getting refugee support in the territory of former Carniola. Majority of them were war refugees. This number naturally does not present all the people who could be considered refugees. In the chaotic political circumstances, confusion about jurisdiction, decreasing currency value, the authorities wanted to cut down expenses for the refugee support. They were shortening the deadline for the refugee support applications, narrowing the justified applicants to those who were evacuated by military command only, restricting the support in regard to the amount of daily income, etc. It is also clear that the documents that the officials could have estimated arbitrarily, it is clear from the documents that the officials could have estimated arbitrarily whom to assign the support. Arbitrary features are typical for the refugee policy also for later periods, along with defining who belongs to the nation. The refugee status, which was supposed to be temporary, officially ended up with acquiring the citizenship, although inferior social status often lasted much longer. Post-war peace treaties predicted a right of citizenship options. Individuals having right of domicile in the former Austro-Hungary could choose the citizenship of the state where the majority of the population was made up by people speaking their language and was of their own race or tribe, as the Article 80 of the Treaty of Saint-Germain specifies. The documents of the district show that the option process was set in practice since 1921. addressing those who could claim their temporal residence in the districts from 1915 on. I would like to outline you briefly the case of Francisca Križnić, a 20-year-old single housemaid, to give you an idea how the process of naturalization could look like. She was of Slovene origin from the village in the Soča Valley that belonged to Italy. In 1923, she fled to her brother to Logatec and followed him to Steiermark, Styria next year. A year later, she moved again, this time to Javornik, close to Jesenice, and then went to Ljubljana. 2 years later, she was in Maribor. In 26, she opened for the citizenship, claiming that she would send her option request earlier, but was convinced that her place of birth would belong to kingdom eventually. Her request, claiming her and her family to be Slovene by nation and language, achieved positive evaluation of requests from the great mayor of Ljubljana, but was later rejected as not being sent in time. In 28, with a new national legal framework in regard to the citizenship was adopted, she applied for citizenship in Ljubljana, but we do not know how this process ended. We have not a clear picture why she moved so often, most probably in search for work. Her mobility hindered her communication with a series of hierarchically organized authorities, stretching her process of naturalization extensively. Documents from the districts clearly reveal that from the 1920s on, new waves of refugees kept coming, this time also from the neighboring Carinthia, expressing fear of the Austrian soldiers and social pressure due to the ethnic origin. However, the vast majority of the refugees came from the west, arguing that their homes have been devastated during the war and their country was occupied by Italians. Social-political tensions and economic hardships made refugee waves throughout the entire interwar period. Slovenian researchers estimate tens of thousands of refugees coming from the neighboring states, Italy and Austria, throughout the interwar period. And also documentation clearly supports numerous refugee waves to the growing social-political repression. However, the documents insinuate also the countercurrent, people leaving the kingdom, in particular for Austria and Germany, in smaller amount also to Italy. These migration processes have not been evaluated. We do not know how much people, much about people who left the kingdom for Austria, Italy, Hungary, and elsewhere as refugees. How many of them were ethnic Slovenes? What were their stories? What were the experiences of women refugees? In particular, Anna Bamberg-Zammer, a post-official literary and historical writer from Lower Styria, who fled from her mother to Austria's Styria in 1919, comes to my mind. She was among 30,000 people identified as German who left the new kingdom after World War I. What does this historiographical marginalization about people fleeing out of the country tell us about the social-political climate in the young kingdom? Where the data of the people leaving the state could be kept? How they could be evaluated in qualitative and holistic sense if quantitative data are merely estimations? It is usually so that refugee statistics correspond to the political goals, and while some institutions inflated the numbers to a certain degree, the others deflated them. Temporality of the refugee status, mobility of the refugees, and inability to clearly define and register them makes the possibility of statistical errors quite substantial, what defines the refugee statistics among the most unreliable data, as also Michael Maras claims. However, the stories behind the numbers share many unpleasant features, but also positive, impressive stories, similarly as we witness today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Urška. The next presenter will be Petra Testen Koren, who defended her PhD in 2011 with the title Domestic Servants in Web of National and Social Relations in the 19th and 20th Century. She was involved in several projects about women, World War I, borders, Russian intellectuals, etc. She also teaches cultural history and is interested in biography studies, gender studies, and the studies of everyday life. Her paper today, or her early stage research, will be about violence against women in the documents of the Archivio di Stato di Gorizia between 1919 and 1921. Please.
Good afternoon. My presentation, which is a part of broader and ongoing research on violence against women after World War I, is based on documents, as you heard, they kept in Archivio di Stato di Gorizia, especially on fonts of Civil Commissariat of Gorizia, Idria and Tomino between the years 1919 and 1921. These documents include correspondence between civil commissioners, so the civic authorities, the army, the carabinieri reports. This is Italian police force, a statement made by majors and other individuals, as well as news published in the local periodical. On one hand, the chosen interval is the result of the organization of the fonts in the archive, but on the other, encompasses the early post-period, which is social and with its social and political changes during the military occupation of the territory in question up to its official integration into the Kingdom of Italy. I will skip the changing of border like Matteo, but I would like you to pay attention to the territory. It's the territory of Gorician province. This is the area covered in the documents, which is marked, I think, in grayish green. Why? This is important because it indicates, by the following two maps, the territory which corresponds with the battlefield of Isonzo Front between 1915 and 17. This is a specific of this area, this battlefield issue, and on the one hand we have a degraded landscape, so fields, pasture, forests, and homesteads or entire villages. On the other hand, this period saw not only an expedited restoration of the landscape, but also, and we heard, the return of displaced families from near or remote parts, the return of refugees, former soldiers, prisoners of war, etc. The military was present in the area and the civil authorities were slowly being established. Today's presentation builds on this post-war reality and is divided into two sets. The first set is associated with the reality of the post-war territory and it is divided into two groups. The first group includes documents dealing with violent consequences of the war, which are reflected in the territory and its population. And the second group includes documents referring to violence associated with the presence of soldiers in territory. The second set, the big letters, is associated with the question of the post-war political violence and is also divided into two groups, or into two great fears of the post-war authorities, if you want, due to the activities. They are potentially dangerous in terms of inciting arrest among the population. The first group includes revolutionary activities associated with the fear of Bolsheviks and the revolutionary turmoil, while the second group includes instances of pro-Yugoslav and anti-Italian activities. For today's presentation, I picked some documents representing above-mentioned groups of topics, and at this point I have really apologized because with the general overview of Matteo and Urška, I really have this first observation, early stages of my fieldwork, so I picked some documents and I will have some comments on them. But they fit on the topics you mentioned before. So, at first we have two letters, you can see on the slide, of two women, addressed to the authorities, both women. a mother and a wife came from a village in the proximity of Gorizia that was populated mostly by Slovenes. Materially speaking, these villages were ruined by the events of unfolding during the war. And the first letter, the mother asked that her son be released. Why? He was detained at the border, this armistice line, upon his return from Russia, when he had been in captivity, of course, as a war prisoner. The wife letter is a request addressed to the authorities asking that her husband returns home. He was a war invalid attempting to return home with his family, who was detained at the border as a former soldier of an enemy, of course. He was incarcerated at a prison in Trieste. Meanwhile, the family returned home, but was financially strained. Anyways, both requests were granted urgently, but these two letters are parts of a well-established procedure of returning of the population to their homes, as we heard before, and the return of, in this case, captured soldiers also. But these procedures were controlled strictly by the state, which made sure that individuals and their families were morally and politically fit. Part of this is also the major assurance. You can see it in the mother's letter. He's a trusty person, of course. In uncertain political and social conditions, a general atmosphere of suspiciousness after the war adds to the psychological pressure felt by the families when attempting to establish private and social normality that was shattered by the war. Such letters might appear to be formal at first glance, however. They enable an insight, to a certain level, into the dynamic of personal distress, forced decisions, which can be regarded as a form of violence, of course, pressures, but also desires and needs experienced by the population, of course, women. The following group of examples I will show you refers to the problem of violence associated with the military presence in the occupied territory. Numerous incidents occur, as we have heard today, and the interaction with the population that are soldiers with the population are a reflection of a tense post-war situation. Let me highlight two instances. The first of which involve, as you can see, harassment of a young couple in front of an inn, tavern. Also Matteo speaks the meaning of tavern in the countryside. Drunk soldier injured a young man. The girl, who took refuge in a nearby tavern, was followed by soldiers carrying bayonets. The tavern keeper's daughter Matilda sustained injuries as well. According to the report, the incident was resolved without serious consequences. In terms of information provided, this report about harassment is a meager one, and is one of many of its kind that bear witness to violence against women and population. But such documents are not preserved systematically. However, it can be gathered from from these preserved examples that they were not the only ones, and that were a part of a much broader pattern or practice, if you want, which accompanies the interaction between the army and the population. Practice that include also sexual violence, which was have been addressed a lot in these past 2 days. The other case, which attracted a lot of more attention, also because it ended in fatal casualties, was the shooting incident in Desclen in August 1920. An 11-year-old child died, as did a 25-year merchant from Trieste, who was in the village at the time. A 30-year-old man and a 70-year-old woman from the village were injured as well. The report about the incident says the drunk soldiers were quarreling in front of the inn or tavern in the evening. Offended that the villagers, men, women and children, laughed at them, they brawled around the village. The first shots were fired. After the villagers had grabbed hold of the most heavily intoxicated soldier so that he would be brought in front of the major, the situation escalated in a proper incident. The soldiers fired shots and broke into the village houses, which made the frightened population flee from the village. But drunk soldiers also managed to cause a general alarm in the neighboring village of Plaven, where they were staying. Soon afterwards, they were joined by members of the local army who were convicted that this was a proper rebellion of the population and blocked the entire area. In the meantime, the army's leadership, which was stationed in the nearby village of Canal, was informed of the incident, intervened and pacified everyone involved. An investigation followed, and soldiers responsible for a double murder, an attempted murder and injuries were reported to the Trieste military court. An epilogue that happened on the initiative, as you can see it in the quotes, of the Gorizia civil commissioner is also interesting, namely a proposal for offering a financial compensation to a mother who lost her son. The commissioner proposed a similar compensation for covering the medical expense of injured 30-year-old man too. But however, in the case of mother, in a letter addressed to the General Civil Commissioner in Trieste, the commissioner stressed the importance of this gesture for the population. The outcome is interesting as well, namely that the granting compensation was to be isolated occurrence, otherwise it would represent a dangerous precedence. What does this tell us? That such incidents of course happened, and this fear of precedence meant that this was a world pattern again, but at the same time it should be pointed out that the authorities was aware of a negative impact such incidents had on population and was strict with the perpetrators. And now we skip this one and go straight to political violence. I have divided the set associated with political violence into two groups. They were both accompanied by the atmosphere of general suspicion and distrust. And the first group, which denotes revolutionary activities associated with the fear of the Bolsheviks and the revolutionary turmoil, was incited by constant social unrest, dissatisfaction with the provision of supplies, and last but not least by strikes of teachers, officials, construction workers, and railwaymen, etc. But in this period, women of this group were subject to the authorities' control, especially as family members of the social militants. The other group is marked by the pro-Yugoslav or anti-Italian activity. It is in fact that political violence played an important role in the post-war transition processes. Women were subject to control here as well. They ended up on lists of suspicious political persons or were arrested due to their pro-Yugoslav orientation, propaganda and actions. And in Gorizia, the three groups were detected as suspicious to the authorities: the clergy, teachers, and influential individuals. At the first glance, with the exception of the group of teachers or so-called intellectuals that is known to include also a large number of women, the clergy and influential individuals consisted typically of men, of so-called pillars of social and political life, both in the Slovene countryside in urban areas. But if we take a closer look at the examples, let's switch this one. The first example refers to a monk from the Kostanjevica monastery. Is located at a hilltop above Gorizia. His distinct pro-Yugoslav stance included also interaction with the female population. As you can see, he exercised great influence on a numerically strong group of Gorizian domestic servants, so the girls and women from border Slovene-speaking countryside employed in the city, and peasants, of course women. He taught them Slovene church song, expecting them to be allowed to take part in a procession, as you can see it on the slide, but his overall political activity was, of course, suspicious, and he was eventually expelled from Italy. But what I believe is important in this case is a reflection on the influence exerted by such pillars of the society on the broader population and thus of women. And the awareness that the pressure placed on the clergy, directly or indirectly, was placed also on the female population. The next example I choose is a list initiated by the authorities. It was compiled between July and August 1920 and includes names of politically dangerous people. The list was made in case of political unrest among the population. Naturally, this is one of many such lists with names of people who are suspicious in different ways. But the list, this one consists of 98 men and 5 women. And it is particularly interesting to note that 2 of them were teachers and the remaining 3 women were housewives. So, this fact shows that also simple women have impact on population and that they were subject to political violence. But pay attention to another name, marked in red, Olga Makuc. She's a teacher, 90-year-old teacher from Vipože. This is a village in the hills in the north of Gorizia. Because in the next example, she turns up to be a daughter of a tavern keeper, a woman, from the village, and the sister of a politically active public servant. You can see them both in this list under the 29 and 30 number. They were involved in a series of anti-Italian activity, as can be seen in the slide, collecting funds of for Slovene propaganda in school, hanging the Yugoslav flag, for which they were punished with the closure of the tavern and sanctioned. But it is precisely this kind of case that draw attention to the vibrant pro-Yugoslav activities in the countryside, where many women were also protagonists in the epicenter of events. Just to conclude shortly, documents of violence against women in the post-war period are plentiful, but the bulk of data are in fragment form and many times merely circumstantial. I think it is very important to consider and analyze these documents in light of the so-called inclusion-exclusion paradox, to put them in the pre-war and war context, to understand them within the legacy of war and condition of peace, and also with regard to the international situation with the peace conference going on. But last but not least, to have in mind that the political violence present in this post-war transitional period will escalate in years to come within the fascism regime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra, for your paper and for being perfectly on time. Our next speaker will be Francesca Rolandi, who defended her PhD about influence of the Italian pop culture on socialist Yugoslavia. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Italian Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Rijeka. She's interested in social and cultural history of the Upper Adriatic area, post-Yugoslav space and migrations. Today, she will speak about violence and transition in Fiume, Rijeka and Sušak after World War I.
Okay. Hello everybody, I'm very happy and pleased to be here today and to present for the first time this research project, which at its very beginning. So first of all, I would like to thank Urška and Petra very much for setting this panel up. Actually today I will present this project, which deals with the impact of the transition which followed the First World War in the bordering cities of Rijeka and Sušak, and the impact that it had on gender issues. We have to bear in mind that today Sušak is a suburb of the city of Rijeka. They had been unified in 1947. So actually I will briefly present the complex context I am dealing with. Then I will briefly draw the structure of my project, and I will move on with a short and of course not exhaustive overview of the impact of violence on both the cities during the transnational years which followed 1918. We also have to bear in mind that both the cities before 1918 were part of the Hungarian reign in the framework of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Sušak was part of the Kingdom of Croatia, Slavonia and Dalmatia, while Fiume was a separated body, which meant that it enjoyed a large degree of autonomy. So it is always hard to sum up all the events that these two cities went through after 1918, but just to give you a short overview, Fiume was initially claimed by both the Croatian and the Italian national councils, and the city was later, at the end, the Italian National Council came into power, and the city was in those days occupied by the Italian army in the joint action of the Inter-Allied Command. And of course, we have to bear in mind that in this command there were different allies which were pursuing different aims. In September 1919, the city was occupied by D'Annunzio and his legionari, who advocated the annexion of the city to Italy and tried to create and theorize a new political experiment, which took the shape of the Regency of Carnaro, which was officially founded 1 year later in September 1920. But already in the late 1920 we have the Rapallo Treaty, which was signed by the Italian Kingdom and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, which allowed a free state of Fiume, drawing on this tradition of political autonomy. So what followed was the expulsion of D'Annunzio from the city, which happened in December 1920 with what has been called the Bloody Christmas. After that we have the establishment of the Free State of Fiume, which actually was never able to function and was finally overthrown by a fascist coup d'etat in March 1922. After that, in 1923, we have the appointment of the Italian General Giardino as the governor of the city, and already in February 1924, the city was annexed to Italy. What happened in Sušak, we had an Italian military occupation, which it was a predominantly Italian military occupation. At the beginning there were also some French troops. It lasted until 1923, when the city was integrated into the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. So these events led to establishment of a new border, which before had been just an administrative border. As you can see from these pictures, it ran deeply in the fabric of the city. In this project I'm looking at both Italian and Croatian archival and press sources, both on the local and the national level. Actually, another question I would like to mention, it's a methodological question, the fact that all the sources I have come across were really fragmentary. And from the document we can see a lack of continuity, which is a kind of problematic for the researcher. And also the sources about Fiume Rijeka after the First World War are scattered in many cities. Some of them have been destroyed in turmoil, some others just disappear. And also we have a lack of continuity in press sources, because there were many newspapers which started being published, then they were shut down, or they maybe their names changed. There were changes in the editorial board. So still it's an additional question. So I would say, maybe we can discuss about it later, that studying transition is not just a historiographical problem, but maybe also a methodological problem, how to deal with this kind of fragmentary sources. Actually, there are many connections between the topic of violence and the history of Fiume, Rijeka, and Sušak. I would say that Rijeka is still, Rijeka, Fiume, and what happened after the First World War is still a topic able to steer tensions, as it is happening these days, both in Italy with the project of erecting a monument to the Nuncio in Trieste, but also in Croatia, where a couple of weeks ago, no, maybe 1 week ago, there was a proposal to rename Rijeka Square after the autonomist leader Riccardo Zanella. Looking at the documents, and here I would like to stress once again that I'm in this preliminary stage of my research, but still I could see that both the cities experienced long transitions characterized by widespread violence, and we can recognize different categories of violence. With the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the rise of competing nationalisms, we have a surge in what we could call a language of violence and exclusion, and especially on the Italian side, a kind of cult of violence, which has also been connected with the exasperated masculinity expressed in sources related to the D'Annunzio's expedition. This language of exclusion was actually it targeted basically all the elements who were regarded as not fitting in the new nation states, which both claimed to be homogeneous, but of course they were rather than homogeneous. So in Fiume, for example, we have the exclusion which was perpetrated by the means of expulsion of individuals who were regarded as undesirable, both from the political and the social point of view. And even if from the sources it is very hard to understand if these expulsions were implemented or not. And of course, if we look at the years between 1918 and 1924, we have an increase in both political and national-based violence, especially in Fiume, but to some extent also in Sušak. I will mention just a couple of events. In December 1919, D'Annunzio's legionari interrupted the plebiscite organized by them when they understood that the results were not going to favor them. So it was maybe one of the first times that violence was used as a political tool. In June 1920, in the same days when Narodni Dom in Trieste was set on fire, in Fiume there were anti-Yugoslav demonstrations which led to the attack of shops owned by Yugoslav owners. And in December 1920 we have this bloody Christmas with fighting between the Italian army and D'Annunzio's legionari. And this bloody Christmas became part of this kind of fascist martyrology, even if there weren't that many casualties. I think it was around 50 casualties on both the sides, that compared to what happened during the First World War was not a very big figure. What followed from 1921 was an escalation of violence, which took the shape of squadrism with fascist groups, which started preventing the free state of Fiume to function. and culminated in the coup d'etat perpetrated by fascists in March 1922. Riccardo Zanella, who was at that time the president of the Free State of Fiume, he claimed that Fiume was the first victim of fascism. I will give just a couple of examples. In November 1922, according to Yugoslav sources, a group of 8 fascists entered into a village in the Rijeka hinterland. They arrested some local Croatian lads. They compelled them to drink castor oil and to wrap themselves up into the Yugoslav flag. So it was very symbolic case of public humiliation. And we have to bear in mind that beside this, the perpetrators of violence, we have other actors which who made this violence possible. And for example, in 1923, when we already have many cases of squadrist attacks, especially against pro-Yugoslav individuals, pro-Yugoslav activists or supporters of the autonomist party. We have a case in September 1923 when the former chief of the police station, who was loyal to the autonomist party, he was in exile in Yugoslavia. He went back to Fiume and he was attacked by fascists. He was beaten. He escaped and succeeded in hiding himself, locking himself up in the washroom of a train carriage. Then the carabinieri arrived, they opened it, and the fascists continued to beat him. So, the last question is how did women position themselves in this context? I would say that women were both victims and actors of violence. In the documents I came across, I found several mentions to the fact that women took part in violent protests. For example, I found a mention of a fight between Italian and Croatian women, and they also, especially on the Italian side, they appropriated this symbology of political violence. For example, we can see from this picture this woman posing with a dagger. But it's interesting that this aspect was mainly erased from the official narrative, which relegated women and their participation in the D'Annunzio's enterprise and also in Italian irredentist movement. This official narrative relegated them to the role of care, so just taking care of men and children. In some other cases, they were also instigator of violence, and you have to imagine a very chaotic situation with many different actors, both regular and irregular troops, in which women were often building alliances and seeking protection. And of course, in much many other cases, they were victims of political and nation-based violence as men, even if it happened to a lesser extent. Then we have gender-based violence. We have feminicide, we have sexual violence, we have domestic violence. I'm still in the process of understanding numbers and trends, and I'm looking very much forward for some comparative analysis in the framework of our project, but still I would say that what I can see from the documents is the impact of the legacy of the war on this kind of violence. So, for example, the presence of different military, regular troops, the fact that many weapons were circulating, and also the abuse of alcohol and cocaine. And I will mention just a couple of cases which happened in the months between December 1919 and May 1920, which I think they are, they are quite useful and meaningful to understand the context. I will start with the case of Maria Scotti, who was a 30-year-old lady. She was killed by a young guy who was a tenant in her family's house. At the beginning, it appeared and it was presented like an incident, but according to the testimony of Maria's mother, she had refused him just before the murder. And allegedly, he screamed, "If you want me mine, you won't be nobody else." So, this guy was sentenced to 37 days of prison. Then we have the case of Vittoria Trinche. Okay, yeah, just 2 minutes and I'm done. Then we have the case of Vittoria Trinche, who was killed by her husband, who wanted to divorce from her, and according to the newspaper La Vedetta d'Italia, he was under the effect of cocaine. Maria Srock was a maid who was accidentally killed by the teenager son of the family where she worked with a gun which belonged to a lieutenant who was renting a room again in their apartment. And then we have the case of a rape perpetrated on a 15-year girl by a group of local teenagers. They were not found guilty because they were under the effect of alcohol. So this was a really sad story, but I think that this last story could tell us more, because in this case, this violence was at least reported as a crime to the police, and there was a trial. And I came across many cases in which women reported violence. In at least 2 cases, it was also domestic violence committed by their husband. So I think that what I could see so far was the fact that women were trying to cope with this complex situation, and they did so also displaying some agency. So this is the first overview of this really ongoing project. I'm very much looking forward to listen to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francesca and thank you to all 3 of you who presented your early stage researches, although it didn't really seem like early stage, but I must say that I'm looking forward for these researches to be finished or completed, if there is such thing as a complete research. Anyway, I would like to give word to the podium, so please, if you have any questions or comments.
I have a comment on you, Petra. I got curious with one of the names of the housewife from Airene, which was Anna Lokar. It is correct? I'm not sure, but this is probably Anica Lokar, the mother of the known newspaper journalist Juri Gustincic. Yeah, she was a known politically active, very militant, and she's a writer. She was a writer, and if you go to read her novels and so, you'll get a lot of information about the activities she was involved in. So she was a housewife, but with an extra curriculum activity beside. So this is it.
Any other?
Thanks for this interesting panel. And I have a lot of questions and a lot of remarks because, of course, it's close to my research, and but we have time to talk about that. I have only 2 questions for Petra and one for Francesca. About the list of suspects, I had found a lot about the Trieste zone and so on, and have you find the same that they say, sometimes the police write Slav only, and sometimes write Slovenian or Croatian. And I don't know. I have no answer about that. So maybe it was only the sensibility of the policeman or the zone. Or I don't know. And also there were lists in some zone where there are few names. Not so in other zone a lot. So maybe we need to connect also this data to make like a map of this. And for Francesca, it's interesting this theme of cocaine because there are a lot of news also in Trieste about the market of the cocaine, but I don't found nothing about violence connected against women, not connected against the market. Was the violence in the market, but not against women, and was not I call excuse to make violence against women. But alcohol, yes, what I said before. And the other point is the protest. We found a lot. So the authority in Trieste was scared that the women was in the protest because they don't know how to manage the protest when the women was in the first line. So they write a lot. They write a few times about that, and they wrote, we expect that arrive a lot of women in the protest, and we don't know how to manage the protest in this case. So thanks.
Thank you, Matteo. Perhaps first about the Slav and Slovenes. Yeah, I think in most cases, in this fragmental documents I saw, they were defined like Slavs. But I have this feeling that where they were dealing with individual person. Sometimes it was referred like a Slovene something. But I don't think this is a pattern. But I just have a feeling that this Slav is more something they used pre-war, and they still have this way of referring to the Slovenes particularly. Yeah. About the mapping, yes, I agree.
Yeah, thank you, Matteo, for these questions. I would say that this was, I think that I came across two cases in which the relation between the abuse of cocaine and violence was explicit. I don't know about other cases. There were many cases of violence, so it would be interesting to investigate more what there was behind it. Also, I think that mentioning the fact that someone was under the effect of cocaine was a way to blame the persecutor. So maybe in many other cases the situation was clear as in this situation, but the newspaper didn't mention it. And about the participation of women in protests, actually on the side of, especially of the Italian National Council in Fiume, they were advertising very much this fact that women were participating, but maybe they were also scared by the degree of this participation. But I don't have materials from a kind of body dealing with internal affairs in Fiume at that time, so that's something that I don't know. And on the Sušak side, I came across many mentions, maybe not that many, but 2 or 3 mentions of the fact that they were scared of the participation of women not in politics but in active protests. And for example, in one article there was they said like, Italians, you will see in 1 year women won't wash your clothes anymore, and they will just be in the street like screaming loud, and they will stop attending domestic duties. So these are just the mentions I came across.
Because Matteo already mentioned cocaine, I would be interested if you, I know it's not your topic, but does it have anything to do with the class? Like, because cocaine was probably more expensive than alcohol. Could you see the class differences? Or do you know anything about the use of cocaine? Because we know that the Nuncio loved it, but I didn't know it was
It's a really interesting topic, but to be honest, I don't have information on that. Because another question, which is also connected with this entire D'Annunzio's expedition and enterprise, is how much it affected the local society, and how much, for example, this abuse of cocaine was something connected with newcomers to the city. So, but unfortunately, I don't have an answer.
Thank you very much for your talks. Yes, the first question is about these newcomers. Also because these women involved in this fighting, in these violent events, are newcomers or are women from Fiume bourgeoisie or from Sušak middle class? Yes, I have also one question about the class belonging of these women, and also about, we have in Fiume or Sušak also peaceful oriented women and peaceful oriented female association. I don't know, because in this multi-ethnic environment, maybe part of female population was more peaceful oriented. I don't know, this is a question for you. The second topic, yes, the use of Slav, of this vocabulary generally in the public Italian discourse is frequent. We have this use of Slav in general, especially in the hate discourse. In the case of educated people, we could find also the difference, but also in the case of the memoir, which I quoted yesterday, the author identified Austrian with Slovene, but also used Slovene. So it's generally this no attentive use of the name of the others, and this very general vocabulary generally used by Italian, we could find one proof of this difficult relationship with the Slovene word, with the Slovene. And I think that is very general. Also, the same use is also in the more Croat context, in Fiume, and so on. Yes, I think that, yes, the question of the class, the question of the, also in the case of the categories of the refugee, and we know that we have groups of teachers who left Trieste and littoral area, and all these women had a problem with the documents and so on. And but I think that in the next months you enter more deeply in this topic, I hope.
No, I mean, in the documents I checked, I actually didn't find any references to teachers. But of course, material, archival material, or material in general that addresses refugees very much dispersed. And also these two districts were very rural. They were not like places to attract people. So they have special, I just wanted to see what was the situation in the rural area, because cities are a little more researched in the rural area. As for the Slavs, I have another perspective as well. I found Slav in the memoir of Slovene writer, and she refers to
the manifestation in Tolmin in 1918, when she said even the children were shouting Slavs ahead. So this was also not only Italian use, but also apparently was not so strange to Slovenian society. Maybe in sense of uniting all the Slavs, you know. Yeah.
Thank you very much to all the ladies for their great talks. And I'm extremely interested, but really extremely interested in Petra's presentation and research, because it links extremely well with the research I'm carrying on anti-Slavism in the Socha Isonzo region during the First War. I don't have a question really, more some suggestion, and what can I say is that that specific use of the term Slavs, Slovenians, began at the exact moment of the military Italian advance. So Italy declared war on the 24th of May, and they started to speak in that way on the 25th of May. So in the light of political violence, in that perspective. Then you speak, in your presentation, you considered especially the period of military occupation, right?
Till the treaty,
Yeah. My suggestion is to take more into consideration the period of the war, because they start a very specific kind of practices against the population in a political overtone.
If you're suggesting the war period,
It's
it's problematic because this was the battlefield situation.
I suggest you to go to Archivio Centrale dello Stato in Rome and to analyze the Ministero della Guerra and the Comando Supremo, especially the files on internment. They are extremely interesting, extremely.
Maybe just.
But I can give you some literature. We speak later.
Yeah, because the question of internment, there's a whole box of documents I have to check, and I saw some fragments from this period referring to that, and with the idea that they were releasing this person of that period, which was in turn because of political violence, because of political actions. So this is very interesting here.
Okay, yes, I will briefly answer to Marta's question about newcomers. If we talk about newcomers from Italy, we have many women, among them coming from different classes of society. Some of them were following their husbands or fiancé, but many others were coming as not that many, but some of them were coming, for example, as activists, political activists, or teachers. But when we talk about newcomers, we have also to consider newcomers from the other side, so from the Yugoslav side. And there is a very interesting question which I didn't want to mention because I'm still trying to understand it better, which was the question of irregular prostitution, in which mainly women from the Yugoslav area were involved, and it's a very interesting question involving an intersection of different factors, class, nation, gender. Maybe we could also add race in the sense of the Anglo-Saxon, that is used in Anglo-Saxon literature, and in the sense that it's used, for example, by Catherine Baker in her last book. So it's a really interesting question, and I hope I will have time to investigate it more. About pacifist women, Actually, it was something that I'm still looking for. I'm sure that there were many women who felt a really deep sense of disaffection with this situation of political violence, but I think that for them it was very hard to find a political expression because first there were not that many women organizations, and the one existing were mainly sections of male-dominated political parties or movements. So maybe the only anti-nationalist area would be the one, the internationalist one, on the political realm, the one connected to the Socialist Party, which was collapsing in Fiume after the war. So thank you for your question. It's something I will try to look for it further in the future.
I wanted just one remarks about the word, the use of the language in an anti-Slavic way, in the sense that the terms, the generalization of the term Slavs don't giving the person the proper identity. You have to go back not only to the war, but to the previous period in Habsburg Empire, but also in William Reichs in Germany, that had the roots of the anti-Slavism in Europe. And then from then we have the roots of this barbarian image of the Slavs and a negative concept that you will find everywhere after during the war, because it's the enemy, and then also during the 30s, the 40s, and during the Second World War, and until now, as we know. And so I think it's not only during the war, but it's began very in the second half of 18th century.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, but also in that area, because I studied Gorizia, and it's war, during World War I, we have everything already settled. And then about cocaine. No, it's interesting because I think we have the question of, I don't know the word in English if it's correct, consumes. Yes, thank you. And we have to bear in mind that what was the idea of the nuncio and of people decadentism, what they were carrying on. And my question is, because in Trieste we had some circles of people who were using cocaine, and they were all addicted in strict circles. It's really interesting that in the police sources you find a lot of these. They are before the war, and I don't know what happened during the war because I never followed such, but they are all involved. They are liber national. They are strongly Italians, and so I was wondering how this market, because it's connected to violence also, to some it's connected to costumes. And I was wondering how it was perceived by women. Then, if these people was addicted, maybe they would have to go to the hospital or to the sanitary. So maybe, because if you find one case, but if you find more, maybe it's a way to understand. My question is, was it a political use of it? Because, as we know, in the consumptions of drugs, we had the political use of it also in the 70s. In the 70s, I mean, in 1970s, I have a wonderful PhD thesis now about it. Very interesting. That doesn't go back to this period, but I think drugs, this is a period when also in these areas began to, and maybe can be connected to violence also. I don't know, just it's a good suggestion, I think, for that you made to us.
Yeah, thank you, Tulle, for this suggestion. Actually, I have, it's what I can say is just what I can suppose. So I suppose that the consumption of cocaine was connected with a kind of idea of hedonism,
Yes, of
and
course.
maybe that kind of modernity. I never came across any information on treatment of cocaine addiction. That's very interesting. One of my main problems I mentioned before is the lack of police documents for that time, or at least the fact that they were fragmented. Consumption of drugs, consumption of cocaine was mentioned in the legionary memoirs, but always as a kind of experience without any negative consequences.
Yes.
And we also, I could also found some information on the, for example, morphine addiction, but it was mainly connected with people who left the city. For example, maybe it was connected, in some cases it was connected with a broader idea of what we could call the question of white slavery, even if it was not called that way at that time. For example, women who left the city, who had the really adventurous life paths, but they ended up in a very
But Fiume and Trieste, sorry if I jump in, were the two ports strongly connected with the white slavery during the Habsburg period. So maybe you could have a trace in it.
Yeah, even if and this is just the last comment, I look at the collection which is in the Central Archive in Rome, on a commission which was set up by the Italian state in 1923 to fight against the white slavery. There was nothing about Fiume, maybe just one mention, but I think that it also depended on the people in charge of it. If the police station in Fiume, there was nothing interested in, no one interested in investigating these topics, then there is no materials on it. So maybe it was not regarded, it was overlooked, or it was not regarded as a big issue.
I would maybe just add here that maybe for a certain class or way of life, cocaine in that time was completely normal. I mean, it was a way of life. It wasn't, and maybe that is also the reason why you can't really find documents in the police files and so on.
Yeah, there are still many open questions.
About cocaine and drugs. May I add that we have some data from the sources of Allied intelligence services for the period after the Second World War, that the groups, the suckers of extreme nationalistic Italian groups or neo-fascist groups, that there were a lot of connections with drugs. With them. And may I add regarding the political violence after the First World War, and it's also for Matteo, don't forget the category of internments. Internments of people and also for women. I made a research of that and I published an article.
I haven't got it yet, yeah. But it's, I had just a few fragments, but there's, I think, 2 boxes.
Yes, because in the documents of that internments, you could find a lot of information about the problems of nationalistic and also of violence against people and women too.
I will just shortly add something about cocaine and drugs. No, because it's a very good topic, and like you said, it's also very much politically and economically also. I mean, I found a document where 2 women, where 2 like very fine women were involved to a smuggler for Italy. In Ljubljana's Hotel Emona. The other thing is, I don't know if you watched the series, it's a very good series with an extensive topic on drugs. Shadows in the Balkans.
it was very, actually there is a picture how actually, I mean a picture, an image how actually the Macedonian separatist group actually financed themselves by selling opiates, because they actually had this production in Macedonia. The poppy actually grows there, and of course this is not cocaine. Cocaine had some other ways to get to the ports, maybe even through boats, but for all this opiate trade actually was very much connected with the highest levels of political powers.
Okay, yes, I think I complete. We are perfect on time. At the end, thank you very much at all for great papers. Thank you very much for very productive discussions and very useful remarks. Thanks, Polona, for your perfect support. Thanks to Gorizia for hospitality, and now we have still a lunch, and then naturally I wish you a pleasant permanence in Ljubljana and a pleasant weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.